Our next panelist is Dr. Evelyn Stiglitz with the Soil Science and Resource Assessment Modeling Team, again with USDA and RCS. And she's going to pick up from Jeff's comments and talk about Seep and its role in providing conservation benefit estimates. So Evelyn, over to you.
Let me see if I can get my screen to share here. Okay, are you seeing the presentation or?
Now we are.
Okay,
yeah,
right, very good. Get some stuff moved around here on my screen. Okay, well, good morning or afternoon, whichever it might be for you. I am Evelyn Steglich. I am the acting Seep Cropland component leader, taking after Dr. Lee Norfleet, who retired just a couple of weeks ago, actually. And I'm also the Seep modeling team leader in Temple. I'm a natural resource specialist within RCS in the resource assessment branch. And today my focus will be basically the Seep survey and how we are using the Seep results to provide conservation benefit estimates to the agency and to producers. So first off, the purpose of Seep is to improve the scientific knowledge and understanding of conservation practices and the effects they have at the watershed level, and to help estimate the impacts and benefits that these conservation practices have, not only at the national scale, but also at the regional scale. Our goal with Seep is to improve the effectiveness of conservation practices, as well as the programs that help support these practices by providing the science and education to producers and NRCS field offices to help enrich conservation planning, which in turn improves the implementation of practices and management decisions surrounding those practices. And it also helps advise policy that will in turn improve our ability to fund and implement these conservation practices. So just a quick history of Seep. In 2002, the Farm Bill included a significant increase in funding for conservation. However, along with that increase in funding came a call for better accountability of the benefits we were getting with that increased funding, which led to the implementation of Seep. So in 2003, we launched our first Seep survey. This was the first comprehensive management survey of its kind. And the survey was a 3-year snapshot of the conservation and management that occurred on each surveyed point. In Seep 1, we had a total of 18,691 usable points that we modeled, which was about 313 million acres of cropland. And our goal is to redo or refresh the Seep survey about every 10 years. So in 2015, we launched our second Seep survey that covered 11,948 cropland points, which was about 315 million acres. What Seep 2 allowed us to see was the change in conservation and management between those two survey periods, as well as the change in the effects the practices had on nutrient, sediment, and pesticide fate. So Seep is, the points that we survey are a subsample of the National Resource Inventory, which is about a 10% subset. It is the best management data of any assessment effort that we know of, simply because it is a direct response from the farmers and from the NRCS field offices about what is actually going on those fields, what types of practices and management. It's a very in-depth survey of the farmer data. With that data, we use process-based models such as Apex to report the edge of field losses, as well as at watershed outlets. The survey itself is actually pretty lengthy. It's about a 40-page document that can take anywhere from a few minutes, depending on what the cropping system is, up to a few hours to complete. So it's not a simple, quick survey. So So we completely appreciate the farmers taking the time to give us this information. The survey covers all aspects of crop production for a 3-year snapshot. Like I said, we get information about their conservation practices, the conservation programs that they participate in, cropping rotation history, the day-to-day field operations, including planting date, harvest date, tillage practices that they use and when they do those, as well as fertilizer and manure application rates and timing. We also get the same information for pesticides, and for irrigation, we do not get daily application, but we do try to get annual application data because we use the auto irrigation function in Apex to model the irrigation part. One of the limitations that we've seen, or that has kind of come into play, not so much in Seep 1, but we've saw it more in Seep 2, and I'm afraid we're going to see it even more so in Seep 3, is that we can only survey one or gather information on one field per operator. So as agriculture becomes, I guess you could say, bigger agriculture, we see less and less operators that are actually operating those fields, and so they've got more acreage, and therefore we're not going to be able to get as many survey points as we would like. We may have to look into some changes for that. But I guess probably the biggest driver for us being able to get all of this wonderful information is that we guarantee to the farmers that it is completely confidential. So that's kind of also a hindrance on our side as far as being able to share the data, because we have to be so careful about not compromising that confidentiality. Because if we do, basically, you know, Seep is over. The farmers won't trust us anymore, and our jobs will go away. Not a good thing. Okay, once we've gathered all this survey data and we put it into the model compatible format, we use Apex to model the edge of field effects. We use Apex because it is one of the most extensively used and tested field scale models available. In addition, we soft calibrate the yields and sediment and nutrient losses to NAS production data and recent published edge of field loss studies. We do calibrate it to NAS county and state yields, simply because that's really and truly the best yield data that we have. But we also realize that, you know, there's a lot of variation within those states and counties. So we try to, you know, there's no way to hit it directly on, but we try to get within, you know, 10, 20% of those, the NAS yields. And we also use Apex because it is capable of simulating well over 100 crops using one plant growth model, but using unique plant parameter values for each plant. And then Apex is able to predict the effects of management and decisions on the soil, water, nutrient, and pesticide movements, as well as their combined impact on soil loss, water quality, and crop yields for areas with homogeneous soils and management, very similar to what SWAT does. And it's Apex's unique feature to be able to subdivide those farms or fields by soil type, landscape position, surface hydrology, or management to represent the crop diversity and landscape characteristics within a farm or field that enable us to simulate the various conservation practices present on the surveyed fields and determine the effects that those practices have on crop yield and edge of field losses. Oops, not too far, sorry about that. Okay, so using the results of our Apex simulations of those two sets of survey data, we've been able to apply the information to various tools and projects that will enable NRCS and other USDA agencies to provide decision-making information to conservation planners and producers that will then enable them to make better educated decisions about the practices needed on their lands to address their resource concerns. So one of those tools is CART, which is the Conservation Assessment Ranking Tool. And this tool is designed to assist NRCS conservation planners assess site vulnerability, existing conditions, and potential resource concerns, and then to provide a decision support system that will provide a consistent framework for conservation planning and prioritization of programs. In this case, Seep outcomes is being used to provide the avoid, control, trap benefit estimates of conservation practices needed to meet certain resource concerns. Another project we are currently working on is the imputation of Seep model data onto all of the cropland NRI points. We are imputing the data based on spatial proximity as well as pedological similarity. Based on the lat and long of the points, we limit the spatial distance to about 140-mile radius. And our thinking there is that with the spatial proximity, the points within close proximity to each other have similar climate and weather. It's also highly likely that those cropping systems, management, as well as economic conditions are very similar within the spatial constraints. Pedologically, we consider the soil name, soil texture, slope, P factor, irrigation status, and the soil vulnerability index to help match up those points. This imputation will allow estimates of sediment and nutrient losses at a finer scale and allow for watershed and state-based decision-making. However, we will have to limit the scale to a Huc 8 level simply because we need to ensure that the data is used responsibly and without exposing the confidential data that could jeopardize the entire Seep effort. Another project that we have in the works is a machine learning project that we are doing in cooperation with the NRCS water quality and quantity team to provide point level estimates of sediment and nutrient losses, as well as greenhouse gas emission estimates. For this project, Seep data is being used to train the model and develop algorithms to predict outcomes based on various input data, including soil, weather, cropping systems, and nutrient application rates. And with these algorithms, we'll be able to, or conservation planners will be able to estimate benefits and losses of alternative conservation scenarios in comparison to current conservation conditions, and then provide valuable decision-making information to producers in regards to the management practices needed on their land to address various resource concerns. And finally, we're working on a climate change project using Seep management data to assess the impact of climate change on the effectiveness of conservation practices. So one of our A&M colleagues is working, he's using 2 climate models from the downscale climate data set, MACA version 2 metadata developed at the University of Idaho. One of the data sets that he's using will describe the climate if we continue with no change to mitigate climate change, and then another to describe the climate if we put our full effort into mitigating climate change. Output from the models will be used to project conditions 50 and 100 years into the future. And he also has plans to expand the current climate models and projections to capture a range of future climates at the national scale, including the least warmest projection, the hottest projection, driest, wettest, and then a middle projection. So with that, I guess I will turn it back over to Harry. If there's any questions.
Well, thank you. I'm trying to get control of the screen here.
Yeah, let me. Now you should.
All right. All right. Looks good. Well, thank you for that wonderful presentation. I'm going to move right on, though, given the time challenges, to, and am I sharing my screen? There's a good question. All right. Our next panelist is Dr. Srinivasan with the Spatial Sciences Laboratory and the Blackland Research and Extension Center, Texas A&M University. And Srini is going to talk about science-based solutions for policy decision-making, dashboard technology for farm to national modeling. And Srini, I'm going to let go of the screen and you should be able to take control now.
Thank you, Terry. Appreciate it. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Let me put it in a presentation.
Looks good.
Okay. So already my two colleagues, both Jeff and Evelyn, talked about the technologies behind that, the models behind that, and the Seep, as well as the national assessment that's going on actually. So what I want to talk about is how are we using the same tools, the data sets and the technologies, and make that available in a more from the point of computational side on a dashboard type technology to model anywhere all the way from a farm scale to a national scale assessments. So I'm going to talk about various tools and technology that we are either already developed or developing and ongoing projects. Not only within the US, we also have a global system that's getting developed right now for the entire world actually. So the fundamental, the foundation of all this stuff is based on this tools and technology that we talked about, which is the SWOT and APEX models. So that's our central kernel. So we have what we call the integrated decision support system, which is collection of models that serves a specific purpose. So that could be at the farm level or micro watershed level, or at the river basin scale, or it could be farm simulation, which is nothing but economic farm simulation to look at the profitability and the cost benefit analysis of individual farm by farm. And all these other acronyms that you see here, they are all extension of these applications from all the way from individual farms to a national assessment. So I'm going to touch on some of this in the next few slides. But just to give you a background, all our models are public domain and open source. All the tools and technology that we develop are always kept in the open source platform. And the data sets extends all the way from local to really pretty much global. So if anybody wants to model any part of the world, they would have access to the data through our website, whatever that's readily available today. And it is all backed up by long-term research data, actually, like Jeff talked about the LTAR data set, for example, and we have our own watersheds in Temple, Texas, that we collect data over the last 70 years, actually. All this data is what really made this model more robust and proven technology, basically. And it's really a long-term partnership with federal, state, universities, and really the global community that's participating in this development of these tools and technologies. So just to give you an idea, the ideas of framework, we have one on this side is a scale of application all the way from national scale to a household scale. And on this axis, we have the socio-economics versus environmental type of tools, and then productivity, like crop productions and things like that. So the primary three models that get used in all of this is the farm sim, the APEX, and the SWOT model. Okay, I don't want to go into much more detail than this, but we have a separate chapters on talking about this framework, and I'm more than happy to share that with anyone. So what are some of the fundamental process that all these models have common is obviously weather. Weather needs to drive the hydrology, and that simulate the sediment, nutrient cycling, nitrogen and phosphorus, pesticide, ag management, bacteria, as well as the main importance that I just talked about is one of the uniqueness in the model that developed at Temple Center is the plant growth component, actually. That plant growth is what ties all these models in a feedback mechanism, thereby everything is tied back to the vegetation growth, okay? So more recently, the greenhouse gas has been included, the carbon sequestration is included based on the century model and the EPIC model, and then also the climate change aspects has been there all the time. And more recently, a lot of applicants or a lot of the users of our models are starting to apply this in the social justice environment, looking at the extreme climates and how that's going to have drought and floods and how that may be unduly affecting certain part of the population actually and underserved populations. So there are lots of new applications that's starting to come about in this topic. Jeff already mentioned about the development of SWOT over the years. This is really used for several different national policies all the way from 1980s to currently. Almost every decade it was used in the national policies within USDA and RCS. And it uses more high resolution, best available high resolution, both spatially and temporally at that time. And the list of data sets, what I listed here is all federal data set, actually all public domain and open source federal data set is what's getting used. And we just crossed about 5,000 peer-reviewed publications from our global SWOT community, actually. And our current publication rate is on an average is about 450 peer-reviewed publication per year using the SWOT model alone, actually. And it's rapidly expanding and globally expanding significantly. And also we have several workshops and conferences conducted just to keep up with the users' demand and users' need and trying to help them to do the best in applying the model all over the world. So some of the dashboard technology that we have developed more recently, when I say recently, I'm talking about in the last 5 years, actually, using all this national data set that we just talked about, actually. I just listed some of the tools here. I may touch on one or two in this presentation. HAWKS, which stands for Hydrological and Water Quality Modeling System. You can model the whole US from HUC 14. HUC 14 is not an official term, but it is the smallest watershed of about 8 square mile or 20 square kilometer watersheds to all the way to the national scale, actually. So we have about around 300,000 of this watershed polygons to cover the whole country, actually. Then we have the HUC 12, HUC 10, and HUC 8. So user can be able to set up a modeling system in any spatial resolution and run the model, not only the historical, the last 50 years of weather data, but they'll also be able to run the future climate. We have the federal government approved 12 different climate change models that can be potentially used to run the next 100 years of weather data, for example. Okay, that's all cloud-based system, web-based system, and one can use it in access it from even a smartphone, for example. And then we have other data information such as the National Loading Estimation Tool and the Soil Nutrient Assessment Program, Small Watershed Nutrient Forecasting Tool, and the Ag Conservation Production Estimator. So all of them are available free, and you'll be able to access that. Each one of them has got its own website. Other than HAWKS, none of them require any ID or password. You can be able to just go and access that at any time you want to. Okay, so as I already mentioned, HAWKS is just a very simple user interface. It's all the data is pre-populated, either by the 8, 10, 12, or 14-digit watersheds. And you can just point and click on any watershed and it automatically draws all the upstream basins and able to set up a SWOT model under 2 to 3 minutes, actually, and then start running analysis. That's our main goal, is not for those modelers who can produce a SWOT model by themselves, actually, without needing to go through the interface, but there are thousands of non-modelers or other planners or other disciplines who may want to have access to the modeling output, like economists, ecologists, environmentalists may want to have that output. So this is a kind of platform that allows anybody and everyone to have access to the data. that's readily available on a public domain basis, actually. And you can perform not only everything online, but if you like to, you can also download on your local desktop and perform the similar type of analysis on your local desktop. You don't have to be limited to only what you can do online in the web platform, for example. So some of the major highlights of the Hawk system is the data is automatically already processed, and it uses web-based, cloud-based technology, and you can access this from any smart devices, for example. And it's a very lightweight. You don't need to have any heavy internet access or anything like that, actually. And it's, like I said, it's not only for the intended for the modelers, but also for the non-modelers, the ability to model any watersheds of any size, from all the way from local to the national scale. And it is mainly allows us to do an interdisciplinary activities with other researchers to have able to not only develop the model, but multi-users can simultaneously access and share that model, so that a group of scientists can work together on that model, not any one individual, and it is all repository on a cloud system, thereby nobody needs to transfer data from one computer to another computer and share the data and things of that nature. And we also recently implemented crowdsourcing. So if you have a better data sources, you can always upload your data, your model, and that model could be shared with anybody for that matter, actually. So you're not limited to only the data sets and technology that we provide, but any user can share any of their technology or their models with other communities. So this becomes a living model that could go on in terms of having able to access that, so that anywhere in the global, its data is the commodity here, actually. It's not the model, it's not the information, it's the data. So instead of having the data locked in few places, this allows us to share the data across various user community and user groups, that everybody can benefit and be able to make use of this information generated here, actually. And we are also continuing to calibrate. We are not just going to give you just the raw data. So this is an effort that's going on, ongoing effort. And the green area that you see here is some form of calibration for water quantity or quality, depending on what data available, actually. And this is continually expanding, and we'll have by end of the year, our goal is to have the entire country at a HUC 12 level calibrated for hydrology, and where possible for water quality, such as nitrogen and phosphorus and sediment. Okay, so another dashboard technology, or the tool that Mike White, the USDA ARS, has developed, is looking at the national load estimating tool. So here you can select a region, select a watershed, HUC 8 watershed, then you can select a different land use and conservation practices, and immediately you can be able to see what will be the impact. These are all pre-built runs that's run with a multiple combination, all the permutation combination of the various effects on applying the different conservation practices, and you'll be able to immediately able to see what are the difference in runoff or sediment or nutrients, and we can track them all through this tool, actually, the load estimate tool. And another tool that Mike again has developed is looking at the conservation reduction estimation. For example, you can select your state, county, and the soil series, and whether you have tiles or not, irrigated or not. Then you can go ahead and select the current condition. You can check all the boxes on the current condition, and you can also look at the future. What are the different conservation practices that you want to implement here, actually? So once you check those boxes, you will immediately able to look at the impact of that, actually. Again, you don't need any login or anything like that to do that, and this is available for the whole US. The last slide I just want to turn to is SWOT or APEX, or the technology that we talked about in the last 3 presentations, is not confined to only USDA ARS or Texas A&M or any of the smaller group of community. It's been widely accepted and adapted by almost all federal agencies, and they have been using this for lots of national policy assessments, including USGS, DOE, for example, NOAA, National Weather Service, US Army Corps of Engineers, US EPA, and many more state and federal and local government, as well as tribal governments, are extensively using the SWOT model and the APEX models for various applications and policy analysis. So let me stop right there and maybe give more time back to you, Terry, and maybe answer any questions at this point, any of our panels.
Thank you,
Wait,
Srini.
a second.
And all right. So first, can you hear me, Srini?
Yes, I can.
Great, thank you. And thank you to Jeff and Evelyn as well. I guess one question would be, and this is broad, but over the course of the last 10, 20, and more years now, there's been this development of the conservation programs and how we assess that. And certainly now, as we're looking at climate smart agriculture, I guess one of the questions or issues we know that our colleagues at USDA are trying to work through is to what degree can we utilize the investments and the efforts that have been made to develop the programs and the tools you've just all shared with us to address climate change and carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas emissions, and to what degree will they need to develop new programs. And I guess if you could just reflect for a moment on the degree to which Seep and SWOT and these other tools can be leveraged specifically to address carbon sequestration and greenhouse gas emissions and soil carbon sequestration.
Okay. Jeff, do you want to take it or do you want me to answer?
Why don't you go ahead, Srini?
Okay. So the main thing that we could offer here is, as you've seen, the data set is readily available for the entire country, actually. It's a matter of defining your questions in terms of policy questions, or whether it is some kind of implementation questions, whatever that may be. Actually, if you have the right type of questions, the tools, the data sets, the models, they are all ready to go. Actually, it's a matter of defining them. We have not looked at that only for greenhouse gas or only for the carbon sequestration. We are looking at the holistically the entire ecosystem of ag. What is ag management is doing in terms of whether it is a runoff or it's a sediment or nutrients or pesticides, including soil health and so on and so forth, actually. So the data, tools, and the technology is available. It's a matter of defining what exactly the endpoint, then we would be able to definitely help in any of those, answering those questions, actually.
Excellent. Well, thank you all, and thank you for getting us back on time. Look forward to further discussions and possible explorations down the road here. So I'm going to bring up our last panel for today's discussion is looking at climate smart agriculture in the context of model intercomparisons and multi-model ensembles. And maybe to help facilitate, I'll just go ahead and introduce the whole panel, and this way we won't have to pause with as we transition. Our first speaker is Dr. Alex Rahn, who's with Columbia and with NASA Goddard, and he's going to kind of set the stage talking about AgMIP and what it is and what it does, and look at model intercomparisons and application protocols across 50+ activities. And I'm curious to hear the explanation on the 50+. And then Dr. Soterios will be talking about integrated cropping systems in climate smart agriculture. And then Greg Kiker will be talking about cut and paste problem here. Sorry, Greg. We'll be looking at range grasslands and livestock. And then Dr. Bruno Basso with Michigan State will pick up and talk about how we do multi-model ensembles.
All right. So thanks, Terry. I'm going to get the screen going here. And I'm presenting on one computer and looking at a camera that's elsewhere. So I'll do my best on that. While I'm pulling this up, I also am just going to note that there are questions being answered in the Q&A. So hopefully people are tracking that, and we'll go forward. So hi, everybody. I'm Alex Ruane. I am the science coordinator for AgMIP and the co-director of the Climate Impacts Group here at NASA GISS. And the goal of my talk today is to think about how AgMIP goes about creating model intercomparisons and applications protocols. One of my roles as science coordinator is to work with AgMIP activities that exist or are prospective activities and want to know how do we get these things going. And therefore there are some common structures and approaches that we have found are quite successful in what is behind AgMIP activities. So before we get into this, I just wanted to take a big step back, because I'm not sure we've said this in quite this direct of a way in this week, which is that what you're seeing, I think, across the last several days is this overlapping set of pressures on the agricultural sector. The world's asking the ag sector to take on at least 4 challenges, each of which are substantial in their own right. The first being to sustainably increase production to provide healthy food for growing and developing populations. The second, to adapt to climate change and ongoing climate extremes. Third is to sequester carbon and mitigate emissions from agricultural lands. And then finally, nothing here makes sense unless we can maintain the financial incentives for agriculture. So any one of these things being formidable, doing them all at the same time is why there's a challenge. And one of the things that I think is interesting is that there is somewhat of a different community looking at, 1 or 2 of these things at a time. And one of the things we want to do this week is to say, can we take on all 4? So within AgMIP, a lot of the work to date has been focused around fundamental agricultural crop responses to hazards and disasters, especially coming out of the climate realm. So we have been developing our crop models and testing how well they perform against extremes of cold or heat, drought or flood, cyclones, extreme storms, air pollution, pests and diseases. And this orange plus symbol is carrying a lot of weight here because there's a lot more that's within this realm. But of course, these fundamental responses are something that we can look at in a real time or a seasonal outlook. I'm going to be building a time bar on the bottom here. So this vertical little slot here is meant to indicate today. And of course, we can monitor any given season up to today, and we can forecast out into the future with some semblance of lead time, helping to figure out what decisions might be supported by this information. This especially is useful for reactive interventions in terms of understanding what's happening there, diagnosing it, and making a corresponding move. Of course, we can take these same models, these same setups, and go backwards in time into retrospective analysis. And I think sometimes this is overlooked, but in the climate community, we found a lot of benefit by doing this, going back and actually trying to detect or attribute what happened in a given good or bad year. That also allows us to use the models to get beyond what really happened and ask counterfactual questions. What if we had planted earlier? What if we had used a different type of seed? This type of retrospective analysis builds understanding. And then, of course, we take these same systems out into the future and ask questions about long-term trends, really beyond a forecasting, predicting framework, but getting into projections and understanding climate change, market influences, policy changes, socioeconomics, and environmental sustainability. And this gets us to these proactive interventions, understanding that the systems are non-stationary and that there are these emerging challenges and systemic risks and approaches we have to take. So this is kind of the overarching view of how we're looking at AgMIP activities across different time horizons and the way we're approaching it. This kind of fundamental approach is part of the underlying rationale behind all of the AgMIP activities that have been formed. Now, Cynthia showed this petal diagram just yesterday, and there continue to be further and further things that are adding on. You can see we've outgrown some of our petals here as more and more projects come online. So I'm not going to go into the details on all of these. Cynthia already has provided a nice overview. But the question is, what gets you onto this petal diagram? What is something that allows you to say, this is an AgMIP activity, and how did these all come about? So there are some common features of what makes an AgMIP protocol-based activity. The first thing is that it furthers the basic goal of addressing current and future agricultural challenges. Think back to those 4 overlapping pressures. And in that sense, everything we want to do should be oriented towards downstream stakeholder decision support. Now, sometimes that may be fundamental research, but we're asking those questions because there is a downstream need. We also are looking for protocol-based activities that enhance community engagement and participation. AgMIP has published a set of principles that talk about the way we are open, the way we give credit to data providers, the way we try to engage within the community and beyond, and a series of ethical things. For example, how do we engage with major agribusinesses or government entities in a way that are kind of just and fair and give credit and opportunity in a way we can be proud of. We also have developed AgMIP tools that help us to translate and connect different data sets and even different models. And then we also do a lot of work to coordinate protocols across activities. So I've just shown all of those 50+ activities on the petal diagram, but what really is exciting is when we realize that what we learned in the wheat pilot can be applied for the soybean pilot, or what we learned in the maize or corn pilot can be useful not just on the field level, but on global gridded estimations of future projections, and even further into the economics. We also try to develop AgMIP activities that involve and respect multiple methodological approaches. So AgMIP activities are characterized by multiple models, could also be methods. So statistical, empirical approaches are invited or welcome. We use multiple data sets, scenarios, and interventions. So the idea is we're trying to use the models to get beyond our comfort zone and ask what if type questions. But also recognizing that the selection of any single model somewhat narrows your perspective and requires additional thinking in terms of the assumptions and biases that might be inherent in your selection of that model. We also try to focus on multiple systems. So we're not developing models that really only work, in the same type of, upper Midwest high input, systems. Maybe, are the fundamental biophysical approaches or other things that we're modeling something that is transferable. And in that sense, we want to understand how we can scale out across regions, species, different types of households, system intensities, management practices, and more. But of course, the bottom line here is that everything we do needs to be rooted in high quality data and designed also to extend to areas that may not have high quality data. So many of the early AgMIP intercomparisons started with a very, very high quality set of field data, but initially only provided a portion of those data so that the modelers were forced into acting the way they might do in a typical new application where they might be data limited. We therefore were able to understand how different models and different modelers approach data scarcity. And then, of course, once we finished that first phase of the project, we filled in the gaps, we provided the rest of the extra data. And of course, as expected, a lot of times the models would converge much more closely to reality with that extra data. But it allows us to understand that challenge and the level of degradation that data scarcity might lead to. The other thing that we typically look to do in a protocol is be very deliberate about what is truly being intercompared. So, for example, it is very important that we try to harmonize whenever possible the specific types of inputs and configuration elements so that the models are actually doing an apples to apples comparison. That also includes scenarios and assumptions about the future. It's not usually possible to harmonize everything. So when something cannot be harmonized, we need a community group strategy to develop something that we can feel comfortable with. We also ask questions about what is hard or soft coupled when we are linking multiple types of models. And we also are cognizant that the outputs themselves are not necessarily consistent enough to be compared. For example, if you're getting outputs on a farm level compared to a county level, compared to a state level, different concerns need to be met. Not to mention if one variable is dry weight and the next one is fresh weight, that you're going to have issues that you might not have anticipated. So being very clear on what that is and if there are translations needed can be important. So these are kind of the types of questions that we often do as we're setting up a protocol. And if we're thinking in this realm here about, could we do more in the AgMIP area around climate smart agriculture? Could we try to confront different models, different data sets? These are the types of things that we need to sort out before that intercomparison is possible. One of the things that we have found is incredibly useful is to not just think about real historical time series and future projections, but to get to some fundamental by design sensitivity and stress tests of the models. One of the nice things I learned very early on in my career from a modeler who was a mentor of mine was that the great thing about a model is that you're allowed to break it. You can keep turning up the temperature until the crops die. You can, do whatever you need to do to understand the limitations of your system. And in that sense, we've done a lot of work within AgMIP, especially around fundamental climate responses. Now we know this isn't the only thing. This is focused primarily on that adaptation side. But as we're thinking about climate change, some of the fundamental factors are the average temperature, the total rainfall, and the carbon dioxide concentration. So what you see here is just a snapshot of a tool that's now on the Impacts Explorer, the AgMIP Impacts Explorer that Roberto showed earlier. These are a representation of global gridded crop model intercomparison results, where every grid cell in the world was run on a series of temperature, carbon, and precipitation sensitivity tests, so that you can slide these slide bars and pick different combinations and see how the crop yields respond. This is an ensemble of multiple models, so you can look across different crops and different kind of modeling approaches in this and the underlying papers that go with it. So this is helping us understand, or at least kind of get our arms around how these different models are responding to fundamental climate responses. Some of these others have also included nitrogen in forms of specific genetic types of adaptation. So these are things that we continue to kind of pull on. Now, this same kind of CTW, as we call it, carbon, temperature, water, and even N for nitrogen, these types of responses are one of the fundamental things we do. And all of these sites that Cynthia showed the other day are places where we've done something like this. And you can see on the right, we've done it for many crop species and different types of system, including pastures noted here as livestock and some things like that. So we want to keep this sensitivity test because it also allows us to overlap and link across different species. And even as new climate model projections come out, right away we have an idea what's happening even before we run the big models. Some of the other things we're trying to do is think about larger systems and larger interactions across disciplines and scales. So this is just a simple story here of what happens on a farm, being one element of a global crop production system, with the total productivity going into global markets and influencing prices, which in turn affect regional markets for food and for inputs, and in turn affect what that farmer might do later that year or the next year. So this kind of cycle here, this type of interactions are things that we need to understand, not just in their own right, but in their interactions. And that requires biophysical models and economic models, and it requires regional and global scales. And once we do this, and we're developing models in each of these quadrants, once we do this, we can ask really interesting questions about climate, development, policy, nutrition, diets, and things like that. So this is the other thing we're trying to do. As we're developing protocols, we want to place them in the broader context, not only so that they are more, not only so they have a bigger impact, but so that we can build larger questions. Here's just one example of something that keeps popping into my mind during the course of this week, which is that we have efforts within AgMIP right now to think about mitigation and adaptation co-benefits, which is really encouraging us not to develop models only on the impacts and adaptation side or only on the emissions and mitigation side, but how do we connect these two? What type of protocols do we need that maybe would allow us at the very least to line up different climate scenarios, ag scenarios, and stakeholder concerns and run it through this process so that we have directly comparable results and can think about trade-offs, co-benefits, synergies, and the policies that might result. So there's some pilot work that Eric and Cynthia and other people are leading in Bangladesh right now that we're excited about and want to bring those lessons here. So as a final set of thoughts here, the AgMIP approaches are designed to support implementation now. We have modeling tools that we understand and can apply. They allow us to go beyond the observed experience and ask questions about what we can do in terms of testing known interventions. They allow us to think a little bit beyond the immediate intervention and ask questions about unintended consequences or feedbacks. Oftentimes it's when you get from one pressure to the next that you realize that there's a transition risk or a consequence, in water quality or in yield, behind the strategy you might be finding. We also, of course, can use models to ask many questions and identify and prioritize strategies before we go to more expensive demonstrations and implementations in field trials and farmer programs. So if we can use these models to at least reduce the number of possible ideas down to a smaller set that we want to bring to the next level, that could be useful. So this is what we can do now, but of course, AgMIP research is also enabling future applications. So we know that the models, are useful, but also could be better. And in that sense, we're constantly looking to improve the model responses and the connections from let's say, a crop model to livestock or water resources or, some economic system. We also want to improve the driving and calibration data. You can get a better model result simply by having better weather data or having a better configuration or of your field or more field trials to make your calibration better. I already mentioned configuration, but of course, if we really know what's happening in the field, we'll do a better job modeling it. And of course, what we've seen again and again across all of the AgMIP activities is that multi-model setups give us the power of ensemble statistics and help us separate signal from noise and model bias from common responses. We also need to think about improved scenarios and specific interventions that we assess. And of course, better ways that we can communicate what we find amongst each other and also in the broader decision support systems. So the final thing here is just to note that what we've been excited about over the last dozen or so years that AgMIP has been going is that we've found that a stable and persistent community can motivate this type of activity and the analysis that follows. One of the most powerful things that AgMIP does is the promise that we will meet again soon. So we are going to talk about this. We're going to come up with good ideas, and there will be an opportunity soon to show us what we've found and done based on the conversations we had today. So we usually plan our global workshops and say, by the next global workshop, this is the poster or this is the plot we want to see. And then the group gets together and tries to deliver it. So thank you so much. Of course, if you haven't already, check out agmip.org to learn more about all of those things that I quickly flashed on the screen. And we're looking forward to hearing more from all of you. Because when new activities are put together, we always send out an email blast on this listserv to see if more people are interested in joining. So that's the best way to get involved. Or if you have a specific activity you want to plan and maybe implement, get in touch with me and I'll connect you with the right people and we'll see what we can do. Thank you.